Hello again. It's fast approaching 10 to 8 if you're looking at the time, but it's time for us to get into this particular discussion now. Last night's 14th annual Ruth First Memorial Lecture at Wits University put the notion of the coconut, simply a black person perceived to identify more with whiteness, in the spotlight. Panashe Chigumadzi, one of two 2015 Ruth First Fellows, spoke to these so-called coconuts and reveals the shortfalls of the country's transformation. Well, it's time for us to welcome her now. Very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning.
The last time I saw you were at Union Buildings,
yes.
Launching Women's Month, so I know you're quite vocal on societal issues. It's a huge pleasure to host you with us in studio. Let's talk a little bit first now about you being named Ruth First Fellow. What did you know about this remarkable woman before receiving this accolade?
I'll be very honest. It was simply a name that I knew before. You know, as we know, there are many struggle veterans. You know, there's your Joe Slovers, there's your Ruth First. But I didn't really know very much about her and her legacy. And particularly, I didn't even know there was such a thing as a Ruth First Fellowship. And I think that also speaks to the ways in which we engage academic spaces, that they don't really include or speak to very often the experiences of black people, of black students. So, you know, for me, I was at Wits for 3 years and I'd never heard of the Ruth First Fellowship. I actually just saw it on Twitter. And that's how I actually found out, oh, there's this thing, let me just try it out. But it's quite interesting. I think that speaks to, you know, the change this year and having young black women specifically speaking about issues affecting them, and that making sure that academia speaks to our lived realities as opposed to it being something that is far removed from us. And
it's quite a skill to be able to articulate that, because sometimes you go through the experiences, but you just don't have the words to say that this is what we're going through and this is how we attend to this particular matter. But I want to ask, what sparked interest in your research? It's titled Of Coconuts, Consciousness and Cecil John Rhodes' Disillusionment and Disavowals of the Rainbow Nation. Quite a mouthful, but simply put, what do you mean?
What I mean is that I think a lot of people who might hear me speak the way that I do, or who know my background as a middle class, upper middle class black person, will be very surprised to hear the kind of politics that I have, particularly very black politics, anti-racist politics, because the assumption is that by virtue of going to these spaces and being accepted and being able to do well in those spaces, you wouldn't be interested in issues of decolonization, transformation, and that kind of thing. And it's really to speak to that experience and say that, you know, people often ask, you know, or people think that, you know, it's middle-class kids at UCT who are being spoiled. What are they really crying about? They should just be happy there at the university. And we're saying that even in those spaces, that's not, you know, what we define as the freedom. There's still a long road to go within that. And that's really what I'm speaking to, that even for those of us who have reached the so-called promised land, we're saying that this is not good enough. This is not where we'd like our freedom as a country to sort of stand still at, and we still need to go through the process of decolonization.
Now, you use the term coconut
yes.
Quite liberally, and I understand you do so because it is provocative in nature. Elaborate.
I think it's a way to sort of to spark a debate, particularly the coconut. It is a very insulting term. I mean, I've been called that all my life, but it's also a way to reclaim and reappropriate. The first instance is a way to recognize how someone like myself, particularly as part of the black middle class, we can be used to almost be a buffer to so-called more radical elements within the economy, right? We're not meant to be the ones who will say give back the land, will say nationalize, or those kind of things. We're supposed to be happy with the status quo because it benefits us. And it's important then I'm using the term as a way to refuse. And particularly it's coconuts like myself who are the ones who sit on the boards of Lonmin and are the ones who will advocate and, you know, call for concomitant action. We're talking about Marikana. We're talking about how us as black middle class people are used as well to maintain the inequalities of post-apartheid South Africa. So this is a way for me to sort of locate it within a long history of people who might have been called coconuts. For example, you think about your Tio Soga, who's, you know, first black graduate of Lovedale, Robert Subukwe. A whole lot of people were part of these mission schools and could have been considered coconuts, but they still refused, you know, that path of being the so-called native elites and whatnot.
And so you termed the phrase a conscious coconut.
If you want to call it that, yeah.
Okay, I need to ask you why this is important in 2015. You know, many people get over it. Apartheid is gone now. We're working in the new dispensation, etc. Why is this kind of conversation, this discourse, why is it important?
I think why this conversation is important, particularly for people like myself, I think we are an experiment. You know, a lot of us are sort of holding our breath. We send the kids to the school. Let's see, you know, they don't see race. You know, that's the sort of assumption we've always had that, you know, it's going to die with the older generation. This younger generation doesn't see race. They've got new opportunities. It's equal, you know, those kind of things. So it almost absolves us from the real work of reconciliation. And as we grow older, you know, and there were a lot of girls from JP Girls High there, and I saw myself within them, right, with that experience. And the thing is that, you know, while you're going through the experience, you aren't going to be able to articulate what is happening. And we've got 20 years to now say, look, we've gone through this experience of so-called the Rainbow Nation, and it's not working. This is not what freedom is for us. So, you know, particularly this generation that was used as this conduit is saying, no, it's not working. This experiment that you've done is not working, and we want to do something else.
All right. Lastly, and as briefly as possible, what do the so-called conscious coconuts reveal about the disillusionment of the so-called Rainbow Nation? You've touched on it a little bit in your last answer, but perhaps going forward, what does this reveal about where we are and where we are going, where we should be going as well?
Sure. So I think what coconuts will reveal is that you can't work yourself out of racism. You can't work hard enough or speak well enough such that racism will end in South Africa. We have to deal with the structural issues, the structural racism that still is in place. The fact that we don't own the economy, you know, we might have political freedom, but we don't have the economic agency as black people. So that is what coconuts can then reveal, that even in those situations where we've made it, we still face racism, and that's why things need to change.
And this is another reason why we're going to be speaking to you a little bit later on in the show, perhaps in the next month or so, where you're going to be representing the likes of feminist Stokvel. If you want to know what that's all about, you'll have to stick around a little bit more. Quick ad break. Morning Live continues after this. My thanks to you for joining us.